Anti-communism is opposition to communism. Organized anti-communism developed in reaction to the rise of communism, especially after the 1917 October Revolution in Russia. Anti-communism was central to Adolf Hitler's rise to power and Nazism and fascism in general, with the NSDAP often warning of international Bolshevism and Marxism. It reached global dimensions during the Cold War, when America and the Soviet Union engaged in an intense rivalry. Most modern anti-communists reject the concept of historical materialism, which is a central idea in Marxism. Anti-communists reject the Marxist belief that capitalism will be followed by socialism and communism, just as feudalism was followed by capitalism. Anti-communists question the validity of the Marxist claim that the socialist state will wither away when it becomes unnecessary in a true communist society. Anti-communists also accuse communists of having caused several famines that occurred in 20th-century communist states, such as the Russian famine of 1921 and the much more severe famine in China during the Great Leap Forward. Anti-communists argue that the repression in the early years of Bolshevik rule, while not as extreme as that during Joseph Stalin's rule, was still severe by reasonable standards, citing examples such as Felix Dzerzhinsky's Cheka secret police, which eliminated numerous political opponents by extrajudicial executions, and the brutal crushing of the Kronstadt Rebellion and Tambov Rebellion. Some anti-communists refer to both communism and fascism as totalitarianism, seeing similarity between the actions of communist and fascist governments. Opponents argue that communist parties that have come to power have tended to be rigidly intolerant of political opposition. Communist governments have also been accused of creating a new ruling class, with powers and privileges greater than those previously enjoyed by the upper classes in the non-communist regimes. Anti-communist movements. Left-wing anti-communism. Since the split of the communist parties from the Socialist Second International to form the Communist Third International, Democratic Socialists and Social Democrats have been critical of communism for its anti-democratic nature. Examples of left-wing critics of communist states and parties are Boris Souverine, Bayard Rustin, Irving Howe and Max Shachtman. The American Federation of Labor has always been strongly anti-communist. The more leftist CIO purged its communists in 1947 and has been staunchly anti-communist ever since. In Britain, the Labour Party strenuously resisted communist efforts to infiltrate its ranks and take control of locals in the 1930s. The Labour Party became anti-communist. Anarchists. Although some anarchists describe themselves as communists, all anarchists criticize authoritarian communist parties and states. They argue that Marxist concepts such as dictatorship of the proletariat and state ownership of the means of production are anathema to anarchism. Some anarchists criticize communism from an individualist point of view. The anarchist Mikhail Bakunin debated with Karl Marx in the First International, arguing that the Marxist state is another form of oppression. He loathed the idea of a vanguard party ruling the masses from above. Anarchists initially participated in and rejoiced over the 1917 revolution as an example of workers taking power for themselves. However, after the October Revolution, it became evident that the Bolsheviks and the anarchists had very different ideas. Anarchist Emma Goldman, deported from the United States to Russia in 1919, was initially enthusiastic about the revolution, but was left sorely disappointed, and began to write her book My Disillusionment in Russia. Anarchist Peter Kropotkin proffered trenchant criticism of the emergent Bolshevik bureaucracy in letters to Vladimir Lenin, noting in 1920 is positively harmful for the building of a new socialist system. What is needed is local construction by local forces. Russia has already become a Soviet republic only in name. Many anarchists fought against Russian, Spanish and Greek communists. Many were killed by them, such as Lev Cherny, Camillo Berneri and Konstantinos Speris. Classical liberals. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx lays out a 10-point plan advising the redistribution of land and production, and Ludwig von Mises argues that the initial and ongoing forms of redistribution constitute direct coercion. Neither Marx's 10-point plan nor the rest of the manifesto say anything about who has the right to carry out the plan. Milton Friedman argued that the absence of voluntary economic activity makes it too easy for repressive political leaders to grant themselves coercive powers. Friedman's view was also shared by Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes, both of whom believed that capitalism is vital for freedom to survive and thrive. Objectivism. Objectivists who follow Ayn Rand are strongly anti-communist. They argue that wealth is the creation of individual minds, that human nature requires motivation by personal incentive, and therefore, that only political and economic freedom are consistent with human prosperity. This is demonstrated, they believe, by the comparative prosperity of free market and socialist economies. Objectivist Ayn Rand writes that communist leaders typically claim to work for the common good, but many or all of them have been corrupt and totalitarian. Many ex-communists have turned into anti-communists. Mikhail Gorbachev turned from a communist into a social democrat. Milovan Filiz was a former Yugoslav communist official who became a prominent dissident and critic of communism. Leszek Kolakowski was a Polish communist who became a famous anti-communist. He was best known for his critical analyses of Marxist thought, especially his acclaimed 3-volume history, Main Currents of Marxism, which is considered by some to be one of the most important books on political theory of the 20th century. The God That Failed is a 1949 book which collects together 6 essays with the testimonies of a number of famous ex-communists, who were writers and journalists. The common theme of the essays is the author's disillusionment with an abandonment of communism. The promotional byline to the book is, 6 famous men tell how they changed their minds about communism. Another notable anti-communist was Wittka Chambers, a former Soviet Union spy who testified against his fellow spies before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Other anti-communists who were once Marxists include the writers Max Eastman, John Dos Passos, James Burnham, Maury Reiskind, Frank Meyer, Will Herberg, Sidney Hook, Louis Fisher, Andre Gide, Arthur Koestler, Ignazio Silone, Stephen Spender, Peter Hitchens, Zita Sebra, Tejas Avalani, and Richard Wright. Anti-communists who were once socialists, modern liberals, or social democrats include John Chamberlain, Friedrich Hayek, Raymond Moley, Norman Podhoretz, and Irving Kristol. Fascism and far-right politics. Fascism is often considered a reaction to communist and socialist uprisings in Europe. Italian fascism, founded and led by Benito Mussolini, took power after years of leftist unrest led many conservatives to fear that a communist revolution was inevitable. Historians Ian Kershaw and Wikimfest argue that in the early 1920s the Nazis were only one of many nationalist and fascist political parties contending for the leadership of Germany's anti-communist movement. The Nazis came to dominance in the Great Depression when they organized street battles against German communist formations. When Hitler came to power in 1933, his propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels set up the Anti-Comintern. Quote, It generated masses of anti-Bolshevik propaganda, with the goal of demonizing Bolshevism and the Soviet Union to a worldwide audience. In Europe, numerous far-right activists, including some conservative intellectuals, capitalists and industrialists, were vocal opponents of communism. During the late 1930s and the 1940s, several other anti-communist regimes and groups supported fascism. The Falange in Spain, the Vichy regime and the Legion of French Volunteers against Bolshevism in France, and, in South America, movements such as Brazilian integralism. Most exiled Russian aristocrats as well as exiled Russian liberals were actively anti-communist in the 1920s and 1930s. In Britain, anti-communism was widespread among the British foreign policy elite in the 1930s with its strong upper-class connections. The upper class that Clive set was strongly anti-communist in Britain. Anti-Semitic anti-communism, also known as Judeo-Bolshevism, is a concept that Jews are responsible for most, if not all, communist and socialist movements as a means of world domination. Anti-Semitic anti-communism is pushed by multiple far-right groups both past and present, including the NSDAP, the Ku Klux Klan, and the National Socialist Movement. Aside from world domination, anti-Semitic anti-communists also assert Jews are responsible for Holodomor, placing the blame of the event solely on Genrik Ugoda. Religions. Buddhists. Thich Nguyen Quam was a prominent Vietnamese Buddhist monk and anti-communist dissident. In 1977, Nguyen Quam wrote a letter to Prime Minister Pham Van Thong detailing counts of oppression by the communist regime. For this, he and 5 other senior monks were arrested and detained. In 1982, Nguyen Quam was arrested and subsequently put into permanent house arrest for opposition to government policy after publicly denouncing the establishment of the state-controlled Vietnam Buddhist Church. Thich Quang Tho is a Vietnamese Buddhist monk and anti-communist dissident. In January 2008, the Europe-based magazine A Different View chose Ven. Thich Quang Tho was one of the 15 champions of world democracy. Catholics. The Catholic Church has a history of anti-communism. The most recent Catechism of the Catholic Church states, "The Catholic Church has rejected the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies associated in modern times with communism or socialism. Regulating the economy solely by centralized planning perverts the basis of social bonds, reasonable regulation of the marketplace and economic initiatives, in keeping with a just hierarchy of values and a view to the common good, is to be commended." Pope John Paul II was a harsh critic of communism, as was Pope Pius IX, who issued a papal encyclical entitled Quanta Cura, in which he called communism and socialism the most fatal error. From 1945 onward, the Australian Labor Party leadership accepted the assistance of an anti-communist Roman Catholic movement led by B.A. Santamaria to oppose alleged communist subversion of Australian trade unions, of which Catholics were an important traditional support base. Bert Crimean, deputy leader of State Parliamentary Labor Party in Santamaria, met with Labour's political and industrial leaders to discuss the movement's assisting their opposition to what they alleged was communist subversion of Australian trade unionism. To oppose communist infiltration of unions, industrial groups were formed. The groups were active from 1945 to 1954, with the knowledge and support of the ALP leadership, until after Labour's loss of the 1954 election, when federal leader Dr. H.V. Avat, in the context of his response to the Petrov affair, blamed subversive activities of the groupers for the defeat. After bitter public dispute, many groupers were expelled from the ALP and formed the Democratic Labour Party, in an attempt to force the ALP reform and remove alleged communist influence with a view to then rejoining the purged The DLP preferenced the Liberal Party of Australia, enabling them to remain in power for over 2 decades. The strategy was unsuccessful, and after the Whitlam government during the 1970s, the majority of the DLP decided to wind up the party in 1978. Although a small federal and state party continued based in Victoria, with state parties reformed in NSW and Queensland in 2008. After the Soviet occupation of Hungary during the final stages of the Second World War, many clerics were arrested. The case of the Archbishop Joseph Mindszent of Esztergom, head of the Catholic Church in Hungary, was the most known. He was accused of treason to the communist ideas and was sent to trials and tortured during several years between 1949 and 1956. During the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 against communism, he was set free, and after the failure of the movement he was forced to move to the United States' embassy on Budapest. There he lived until 1971, when the Vatican and the communist government of Hungary pacted his way out to Austria. In the following years, Mindszent traveled all over the world, visiting the Hungarian colonies in Canada, United States, Germany, Austria, South Africa and Venezuela. He led a high critical campaign against the communist regime, denouncing the atrocities committed by them against him and the Hungarian people. The communist government accused him and demanded that the Vatican remove him the title of Archbishop of Esztergom and forbid him to make public speeches against communism. The Vatican eventually annulled the excommunication imposed on his political opponents, and stripped him of his titles. The Pope, who declared the Archdiocese of Esztergom officially vacated, refused to fill the seat while Mindszent was still alive. Falun Gong practitioners are against the Communist Party of China's persecution of Falun Gong. In April 1999, over 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners gathered at Communist Party of China headquarters, Zhongnanhai, in a silent protest following an incident in Tianjin. 2 months later, the Communist Party banned the practice, initiated a security crackdown, and began a propaganda campaign against it. Since 1999, Falun Gong practitioners in China have been subject to torture, arbitrary imprisonment, beatings, forced labor, organ harvesting, and psychiatric abuses. Falun Gong responded with their own media campaign, and have emerged as a notable voice of dissent against the Communist Party of China, by founding organizations such as the Epoch Times, NTD-TV and others that criticize the Communist Party. In 2006, allegations emerged that the large number of Falun Gong practitioners had been killed to supply China's organ transplant industry. The Kilgore Matters report found that the source of 41,500 transplants for the 6-year period 2000 to 2005 is unexplained, and concluded that there has been and continues today to be large-scale organ seizures from unwilling Falun Gong practitioners. Ethan Goodman estimated that 65,000 Falun Gong practitioners were killed for their organs from 2000 to 2008. In 2009, courts in Spain and Argentina indicted senior Chinese officials for genocide and crimes against humanity for the role in orchestrating the suppression of Falun Gong. Evasion of censorship. It was a key form of dissident activity across the Soviet bloc. Individuals reproduced censored publications by hand and passed the documents from reader to reader, thus building a foundation for the successful resistance of the 1980s. This grassroots practice to evade officially imposed censorship was fraught with danger, as harsh punishments were meted out to people caught possessing or copying censored materials. Vladimir Bukovsky defined it as follows: I myself create it, edit it, censor it, publish it, distribute it, and get imprisoned for it. During the Cold War, Western countries invested heavily in powerful transmitters which enabled broadcasters to be heard in the Eastern Bloc, despite attempts by authorities to jam such signals. In 1947, VOA started broadcasting in Russian with the intent to counter Soviet propaganda directed against American leaders and policies. These included Radio Free Europe, RIAS the Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, Radio France International, and the British Broadcasting Corporation. The Soviet Union responded by attempting aggressive electronic jamming of VOA broadcasts in 1949. The BBC World Service similarly broadcast language-specific programming to countries behind the Iron Curtain. In the People's Republic of China, people have to bypass the Chinese internet censorship and other forms of censorship.